The wind was a blade against the bones of the world. It sharpened itself on the granite peaks of the mountains and swept down across the plains, shearing the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and driving dust into the cracks of every wall and every heart. Thomas Hale felt it in the hollow space that had taken up residence inside his chest since Mary's passing. It was a cold that had little to do with the late winter chill and everything to do with the silence of his cabin. He guided the wagon into the barn, the weary movements of his body a testament to a grief that had settled into his marrow. The journey from town was a necessary evil, a brief and jarring encounter with a world that continued to turn, oblivious to the fact that his own had stopped. He unhitched the horses, their warm breath pluming in the frigid air, their presence a small, living comfort in the vast emptiness. As he moved to pull the canvas tarp over the wagon bed, a sound, faint and muffled, snagged his attention. It was not the familiar settling of grain sacks or the creak of wood. It was small. It was alive. Claire had held her breath until her lungs burned, a fire that did nothing to warm the ice in her veins. Every jolt of the wagon on the rutted track had been a fresh wave of terror. Tucked into the far corner, beneath the heavy canvas that smelled of dust and oil and distant fields, she had pressed her face into the swaddling of the babe in her right arm, trying to muffle her own ragged breathing against its tiny form. The other, nestled against her left side, whimpered, a sound she immediately smothered with the palm of her hand, whispering a frantic, soundless prayer. Cold had seeped through her worn shawl, through the thin fabric of her dress, until she no longer felt her feet. But it was the cold of discovery she feared most. She had been running for so long, the world a blur of hostile landscapes and suspicious eyes. This wagon, this dark and swaying refuge, was the most desperate gamble of her life. When the wagon stopped and the world outside fell into a sudden, deep silence, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the clink of harnesses, the heavy sigh of a horse, the crunch of boots on frozen earth. The sounds were achingly normal, a life continuing just inches from her own suspended one. Then the canvas began to move. Light, gray and unforgiving, sliced into her hiding place. She squeezed her eyes shut, a final, futile defense. She could not run. She could not fight. She could only wait for the inevitable curse, the shout, the violence of being found. When she forced her eyes open, she saw him, a man silhouetted against the stark light of the barn door. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, his face shadowed and unreadable. He did not move. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on her, then dropping to the two small bundles in her arms. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. One of the babies chose that moment to let out a small, fretful cry, a sound that seemed to shatter the stillness into 1,000 pieces. Claire flinched, expecting the man's face to harden into anger. Instead, something shifted in the lines of his jaw, a flicker of an emotion she could not name. It was not pity, not yet. It was something deeper, a sort of weary recognition. He saw the frayed edges of her shawl, the desperation etched into her young face, the fierce, protective curve of her arms around her children. He saw not a thief or a vagrant, but the stark, unadorned shape of survival. He took a slow breath, the cold air rasping in his throat, and looked from her face to the path leading from the barn to the small, sturdy cabin from which a thin curl of smoke rose, a fragile signal of life against the immense, indifferent sky. He did not speak. He simply gestured with his head toward the cabin, a single, curt movement that was not a question, but a command born of something other than authority. It was an offering, stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. For a long moment, Claire remained frozen, a knot of fear and distrust coiled in her stomach. Every stranger was a threat, every outstretched hand a potential trap. Elias Run had taught her that lesson with a brutal finality. Her muscles screamed to stay hidden, to burrow deeper into the hay-scented darkness of the wagon. But the babe in her arms, Luke, began to fuss in earnest, his small face puckering against the cold. The other, Anna stirred, her tiny fists balling. They were cold. They were hungry. Her own needs had long been relegated to a distant echo, but theirs were a clarion call, a demand that overrode her own terror. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to move. Her limbs were stiff, her body a clumsy cage of aches and exhaustion. She climbed over the side of the wagon, her worn boots landing with a soft thud on the frozen ground. She kept her eyes down, her focus entirely on the precious, fragile weight of her children. The walk to the cabin was the longest of her life. The man, Thomas, walked a few paces ahead, his silence a heavy blanket. He did not look back. He opened the door and stood aside, holding it for her. The wave of warmth that washed over her was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. It smelled of wood smoke, old timber, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender and bread, a ghostly perfume of a life that was no longer there. The inside was as spare as the man himself. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire whispering and spitting within it. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. A bed, neatly made, occupied one corner, and a smaller cot was pushed against the opposite wall. It was a place of solitude, meticulously clean but echoing with absence. She saw a woman's touch in the faded quilt on the bed, in the small, chipped pitcher on the mantelpiece holding a spray of dried wildflowers. The sight sent a pang of an unfamiliar emotion through her. Not just fear, but a sense of trespass, of intruding on a grief as palpable as the fire's heat. Thomas closed the door, shutting out the wind, and the silence in the room became even more profound. He moved to the hearth, adding a log to the fire without a word. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Claire, still standing just inside the door, swayed on her feet. He turned, his eyes, a clear pale gray like a winter sky, finally meeting hers directly. "Sit," he said. His voice was rough, as if from disuse. He gestured to one of the chairs at the table. She obeyed, sinking into the chair, the solid wood a comfort against her trembling back. He then moved to the stove, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. He set on a table in front of her, along with a piece of dark bread and a mug of water. It was a simple stew, rich with the smell of root vegetables and meat. He made no move to eat himself, but took the other chair, watching her with that same unnerving stillness. She looked from the food to her babies, who were now beginning to cry in earnest. A flush of shame and desperation rose in her throat. Before she could find the words to ask, he seemed to understand. He rose again and returned with a dipper of warmed water from a kettle on the stove. He said nothing, simply placed it on the table, his meaning clear. With clumsy, shaking fingers, Claire tended to her children first, mixing a little of the precious, dwindling supply of powdered milk she carried in a small tin with the warm water. As she fed them, their cries subsided into soft, contented gurgles, and the tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. Only then did she pick up the spoon and begin to eat, the warmth of the stew spreading through her, a fragile truce against the cold that had claimed her for so long. Days bled into one another, marked not by conversation, but by the steady, quiet rhythm of necessity. A fragile routine began to weave itself into the fabric of the cabin silence. Claire rose before the sun. The infants needs her first and most urgent call. She would feed them and change them by the low light of the hearth, which Thomas always kept banked through the night. He would rise shortly after, his movements economical and silent as he pulled on his boots and coat to face the morning's chores. He never spoke of her presence, never asked for her story. He simply accepted it, as one accepts the turning of a season. In return, she began to make herself useful, a silent repayment for the sanctuary he provided. She found a rhythm in his life and inserted herself into its empty spaces. She swept the wide plank floors, her broom whispering against the wood. She washed the few dishes, scrubbed the heavy iron pot, and learned the particularities of the wood stove, coaxing it to life to heat water or bake a dense, serviceable bread from the flour he kept in a tin bin. Her hands, chapped and raw from the cold, slowly found purpose again. She discovered a small sewing basket tucked away on a shelf, its contents neat and untouched. Inside, beside the spools of thread and packets of needles, lay a silver thimble worn smooth with use. A pang of intrusion struck her again, sharp and sudden. This was Mary's. This was the intimate tool of the woman whose ghost still inhabited this small house. Claire hesitated for a full day before opening it again, driven by the sight of a tear in Thomas's canvas work coat. She mended it with small, precise stitches, her needlework a quiet language of gratitude. When he came in that evening, he saw the coat hanging on its peg, the repair almost invisible. He ran his thumb over the seam, his expression unreadable, but he wore it the next morning without comment. The gesture was a conversation in itself, an acknowledgment that passed between them in the quiet air. She watched him from the cabin window as he worked, his lone figure moving against the vast, snow-dusted landscape. He split wood with a powerful, relentless rhythm, the axe falling with a clean, final sound. He tended to his animals with a gruff gentleness, his large hands surprisingly deft as he checked a horse's hoof or scattered grain for the chickens. There was a deep-seated competence in him, a steadiness that was as reliable as the sunrise. She saw the grief in the slump of his shoulders when he thought no one was watching, in the way his eyes would sometimes fix on the middle distance, lost in a memory she could not access. His sorrow was a quiet, formidable thing, a wall he had built around himself. Yet, through the cracks, she was beginning to see something else. One afternoon, he came inside with a small block of pine and sat by the fire, his penknife moving with slow, deliberate strokes. For an hour, he carved, the shavings falling onto the hearthstones. When he was finished, he wordlessly placed a small, smooth shape of a bird into her hand as she rocked Luke. The simple, unadorned toy was a profound offering. It was the first object of beauty, of non-necessity, that had entered her life in months. She looked up at him, her throat tight, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, the harsh lines of his face softened in return. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the low hum of a shared existence, a fragile piece being built one quiet gesture at a time. The nights were the hardest. In the deep, starless dark, the fragile piece of the day unraveled, and the past came for her. It arrived not as a memory, but as a living thing, with Elias Wren's scent of cheap whiskey and damp wool, his voice a venomous whisper in her ear. She would be back in that cramped, joyless room, the air thick with his oppressive presence, his ownership of her a physical weight on her soul. He had not wanted the children. They were an inconvenience, a messy complication to his claim on her. Her defiance in fleeing with them had been the one act of rebellion in a life of terrified acquiescence. One night, the dream was more vivid than usual. She felt the splintered wood of a door frame against her back, heard the sneering laugh that always preceded his cruelty. She woke with a strangled cry caught in her throat, bolting upright on the cot, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. The babies, disturbed by her terror, began to wail in the darkness. Instantly, a shape moved across the room. She saw Thomas's silhouette against the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. He did not light a lamp. He simply came and stood near her cot, a silent, looming presence. A bad dream, he stated, his voice low and calm. Not a question, but a fact. Claire couldn't speak. She was trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering with a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She clutched the rough blanket to her chin, the terror of the nightmare still clinging to her like a shroud. He pulled one of the chairs from the table and placed it near her, then sat, his posture relaxed, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. He didn't press her, didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just sat, a guardian in the dark, his quiet vigil a powerful testament of safety. He waited as she soothed the crying children, her whispers to them shaky and breathless. Minutes stretched into an hour. The only sound were the settling of the fire, the soft breathing of the infants, and the slow receding of her own panic. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, raw and broken, she spoke into the darkness. His name is Elias Run. The name felt like a poison on her tongue, a word she had tried to bury. Saying it aloud felt like a betrayal of her own flight, as if it might summon him from the shadows. Thomas remained silent, listening. Encouraged by the non-judgmental darkness, the words began to spill out, fragmented and halting. He said I was his, that they were his, not because he wanted them, but because they came from me. Like livestock, her voice broke on the last word. A tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down her cheek. He wasn't their father. He just took me. After my own pa died, she didn't need to explain the details. The shame and horror were thick in her voice. I had to run. He would have gotten rid of them. To have me to himself, she fell silent, exhausted by the confession, bracing for his disgust, for the withdrawal of his protection. She had laid the ugliest parts of her life at his feet. After a long pause, Thomas finally spoke, his voice still low, but carrying a weight of absolute conviction that cut through the darkness. He won't find you, he said. And then, after another moment, you're safe here, Claire. It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, spoken in his steady voice, was a balm on her rawest wound. It was a promise, and in the quiet certainty of that promise, she felt the first true seed of strength begin to take root in the barren soil of her fear. As the last of the stubborn snow receded, surrendering its grip on the land, the world outside the cabin began to change. The thaw was not a gentle affair, but a messy, dramatic transformation. The frozen earth softened into a sea of mud, and the creek behind the cabin, for weeks a silent ribbon of ice, swelled into a rushing, churning torrent. It was a sound of release, of life breaking free from its winter prison. That same sense of awakening began to stir within the cabin walls, a slow, internal thaw that mirrored the season. With the arrival of spring came a new dimension to their shared life, one that moved beyond the confines of the house and out into the open air. The time for mere survival was passing. The time for building had begun. Thomas announced one morning, "We'll put in a garden." It was a declaration of faith in the future, a belief in planting and reaping that Claire had not dared to entertain for months. He showed her how to prepare the soil, turning over the dark, rich earth with a spade, his movements strong and sure. She followed behind him, breaking up the clods of dirt with a hoe, her hands sinking into the cool, damp ground. The work was hard, staining her clothes and tiring her muscles, but it was a good weariness. It was the ache of creation. He taught her things she had never known, the quiet wisdom of a man who understood the land. He showed her how to read the sky for rain, how to test the soil's readiness between her fingers, how to plant the precious seeds, corn, beans, squash, at the proper depth, giving each one the best chance at life. She was a quick study, her focus intense. As she worked, she would often lay the babies on a thick blanket at the edge of the plot, their curious eyes following her movements, their soft coos and gurgles a gentle soundtrack to the labor. Their presence consecrated the space, turning a patch of dirt into a place of hope. In turn, Claire brought a different kind of life to the homestead. She found a wild patch of mint growing near the creek and transplanted it to a small box outside the kitchen window. She aired out the cabin, letting the fresh, sun-warmed breeze chase away the last of the winter's stale air. The sound of the babies, now growing more expressive, filled the once silent rooms. Luke's delighted shrieks as he discovered his own feet, and his soft, contented sighs as she slept in a sliver of sunlight on the floor. These sounds began to stitch themselves into the home's fabric, mending the quiet tears of Thomas's grief. Their conversations grew more frequent, no longer confined to the barest of necessities. They spoke of the garden, of the weather, of which fences needed mending before the cattle could be led into the upper pasture. He started talking about Mary, not in long speeches, but in small, incidental ways. Mary always said the beans do best planted next to the corn. He'd remark, his voice matter of fact. but his eyes distant. Claire listened, understanding that he wasn't just sharing farming advice. He was opening a door, letting her see the shape of the life that had been here before. She was no longer just a refugee in his home. She was becoming a participant in its continuation, a partner in the slow, hopeful work of planting new seeds in a ground that had once seemed irrevocably frozen. The day Thomas announced he had to go to town for supplies, a cold dread washed over Claire, immediate and sickening. The cabin and the small piece of land around it had become her entire world, a sanctuary whose boundaries she had not dared to cross. The thought of being left alone, even for a day, reawakened the dormant fear of Elias Run. What if he came while Thomas was gone? The possibility was a physical weight pressing the air from her lungs. Thomas must have seen the panic in her eyes. He stood by the door, his hat in his hand, his brow furrowed. "I can't put it off any longer," he said, his tone apologetic. "We need flour. Salt." He hesitated, his gaze falling on the children playing on their blanket. A silent debate seemed to pass across his face. "You'll come with me," he decided, the words leaving no room for argument. "All of you." The journey felt different this time. Instead of hiding in terror under a canvas, she sat on the wagon bench beside him, Anna bundled in her lap, while Luke slept in a wooden crate padded with quilts at her feet. But the feeling of exposure was immense. Every mile that took them further from the homestead felt like a mile stripped from her armor. The town was a jarring assault on her senses. After months of quiet, the noise of voices, of wagons, of a blacksmith hammer was overwhelming. People turned to look as they rode down the main street. She felt their eyes on her plain, mended dress, on the two infants. She saw the whispers pass between women, the speculative glances of the men loafing outside the general store. She was an anomaly, a woman with two babies and no husband, riding beside the town's most solitary and grieving widower. The judgment in the air was as thick as dust. Inside the store, the feeling intensified. The storekeeper, a balding man with watery, inquisitive eyes, greeted Thomas with a familiarity that quickly curdled into prying curiosity as he looked at Claire. "Thomas," he said, his smile thin. "Been a while. See, you've got company." The unspoken questions hung in the air. Thomas's face hardened. He ignored the man's bait, his voice flat as he listed the supplies he needed. Flour, 20 pounds, lard, salt, and coffee. While Thomas dealt with the transaction, Claire kept her back to the room, pretending to examine a bolt of calico, her heart pounding. It was then that she saw him, a man near the doorway, burly and unshaven, with a cruel set to his mouth that was sickeningly familiar. He wasn't Elias, but he was of the same ilk, one of the men who drank with him, who laughed at his brutish jokes. The man's eyes flickered over her, a flicker of greasy recognition, and a wave of pure, visceral panic washed through her. She felt her knees go weak. Thomas, sensing the sudden tension in her, turned. He saw the direction of her gaze, saw the blood drain from her face. Without a word, he finished his business, his movements becoming clipped and efficient. He took the heavy sacks himself, and then placed a firm, steadying hand on the small of her back, guiding her out of the store. He stood a little closer to her as he loaded the wagon, his body a solid shield between her and the prying eyes of the town. The ride home was steeped in a heavy silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of a shared understanding. He now knew, in a way he hadn't before, that the sanctuary of his homestead was not just a refuge from her past, but a fortress against a present and hostile world. The shadow they had been living under finally took form a week later. It arrived on a day that had, until then, felt deceptively peaceful. The sun was warm, the garden was sprouting green, defiant life, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. Claire was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two trees, the white sheets brilliant against the blue sky, when the sound of a lone rider approaching made her freeze. It wasn't Thomas's steady pace. This was faster, more arrogant. Her heart leaped in her throat. She turned, and there he was, a dark figure on a black horse, cresting the small rise that led to the cabin. Elias Reing. He looked just as she remembered, his face fleshy and smug, his eyes small and possessing. He reined in his horse a few yards from her, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a proprietary air. The cabin, the laundry, her. He dismounted slowly, his movements dripping with a confidence that made her stomach clench. Thomas came out of the barn, a pitchfork still in his hand. He moved to stand between Claire and the newcomer, his body a silent, immovable wall. His face was a mask of cold composure, but Claire could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight grip of his hands on the wooden handle. "You're on private land," Thomas said, his voice low and even, yet carrying a clear threat. Elias laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I'm not here for your land, farmer. I'm here for my property." He jerked his chin toward Claire. "Her, and the brats she stole from me." Claire flinched as if struck. The old fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. Her first instinct was to run, to hide, to disappear. She took a step back, her hand flying her mouth. She could feel Thomas's presence in front of her, solid and unyielding, but the terror was her own, a cage she had lived in for so long. But then something shifted. From inside the cabin, she heard a cry. Luke, waking from his nap. The sound cut through the fog of her fear. It was the sound of her reason for running, her reason for fighting. Her gaze lifted from the ground and met Elias's. She saw him not as the monster of her nightmares, but as what he was, a cruel, grasping man whose power was built entirely on her fear. She thought of the past months, the quiet dignity Thomas had shown her, the feel of the earth in her hands as she planted seeds, the weight of her own healthy children in her arms. This was her life now, a life she had earned. A slow, burning anger began to replace the fear. She took a deliberate step forward, moving from behind the shelter of Thomas's body to stand beside him. Elias's smirk faltered for a second, surprised by her movement. "I'm not your property," she said. Her voice shook, but it was clear and carried in the still air. "And these are my children." Elias's face darkened with rage. "You belong to me, girl. The law says—" She cut him off, her voice gaining strength. "No," she said, the single word a declaration of war. "I belong to myself. And this is my home." She stood her ground, her chin high, her eyes locked on his. She was no longer a frightened girl hiding in a wagon. She was a woman defending her world. Thomas remained at her side, his rifle now leaning casually against the barn door a few feet away, but he knew, and Elias knew, that the most powerful weapon on the homestead had just been fired. It was Claire's voice. Elias Runn stared at her, his face a mottled canvas of shock and fury. Her defiance had clearly caught him off guard. He was accustomed to her cowering, to her silent tears. For a moment, he seemed at a loss, his bluster punctured. He looked from her resolute face to the stoic, immovable man at her side, then back again. "This isn't over," he snarled, the threat lacking its earlier conviction. He spat on the ground, a gesture of petty contempt, then remounted his horse. He cast one last, venomous glare at them before wheeling the animal around and riding off, leaving a cloud of dust and a disturbed, heavy silence in his wake. The immediate danger was gone, but the peace he had shattered could not be so easily restored. The moment he was out of sight, the strength that had buoyed Claire up drained away, leaving her trembling, her legs threatening to give way. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas's hand was on her arm, steadying her. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "He's gone." He guided her toward the cabin, his presence a solid anchor. Inside, the babies, sensing the tension, were both crying. The sound was a raw, discordant note in the aftermath of the confrontation. The familiar domestic space felt violated, tainted by Elias's presence. Claire moved automatically to comfort her children, picking up Anna, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Thomas took Luke, holding the fussing infant against his broad chest with a surprising gentleness. He settled the baby before turning his attention back to her. He guided her to a chair by the hearth, and went to the stove to make tea, his movements deliberate and calming. He placed the warm mug in her hands, his fingers brushing hers. The simple contact was grounding, a reminder that she was not alone. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the now sleeping infants. The shared adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbed away, leaving a quiet, shared exhaustion in its place. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence, his eyes on the flames. "Her name was Mary," he said, his voice quiet and reflective. "We were married 7 years. This cabin, we built it together." Claire listened, her heart aching for him. He had never spoken of his wife so directly. The fever took her last winter. Fust. One day, she was hanging laundry on that same line. The next, she was gone. He paused, swallowing hard. The silence, it was the worst part. This house was always full of her. Her singing, her laugh. He looked over at Claire, his gaze direct and filled with a profound, shared understanding. "You and the children, you brought the sound back." It was a confession of immense vulnerability, a sharing of his own deep wound. In that moment, he was not just her protector. He was her equal in grief, her partner in survival. He had seen the ugliest part of her past, and she was now seeing the deepest part of his sorrow. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were two souls who had stood together on the precipice and had chosen not to fall, held fast by a bond forged in the crucible of their respective pains. The last of the shadows between them had finally dissolved in the warm light of the fire. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, a new kind of peace settled over the homestead. It was not the fragile, tentative peace of before, but something more robust, more certain. The fear of Elias Wren's return gradually faded, replaced by the sturdy reality of their shared life. The garden thrived under their combined care. Its green rose a testament to their labor. The days fell into a comfortable, established rhythm, a life built not on grand pronouncements, but on the accumulation of small, quiet moments. The shared meal at the end of a long day, the comfortable silence as they sat by the fire, the sound of the children's laughter filling the spaces that had once been hollow. They had become a unit, a family in all but name, their partnership seamless and unspoken. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other's work. One evening, after the children were asleep in their small bed, Claire was mending one of Luke's blankets by the firelight. Thomas sat across from her, cleaning a piece of horse tackle, the scent of leather oil filling the air. The atmosphere was one of deep domestic contentment. He set his work aside and watched her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Claire," he said, his voice drawing her attention from her needlework. She looked up, her hands stilling in her lap. "Marry me," he said. The words were simple, direct, devoid of any flowery sentiment. It was not a question born of romantic passion, but a proposal of profound, practical love. It was an offering of permanence, of legitimacy. "Let me give you my name, my protection. Let them be my children. In the eyes of the law and everyone else." He leaned forward slightly, his earnest gaze holding hers. "No one will question you then. No one will dare try to take you from here. This will be your home, truly and forever." Claire stared at him, the weight of his words settling over her. He was offering her not just a ring or a vow, but a fortress. He was offering to place his name, his reputation, his very life between her and the world that had been so cruel. It was the ultimate act of solidarity, the final unbreakable seal on the sanctuary he had provided. She thought of the terrified woman who had hidden in his wagon, a ghost of a person with nothing but 2 babies and a heart full of fear. And she looked at the man before her, a man who had seen her at her most broken and had not turned away, but had instead offered her the quiet, sturdy gift of his strength. Her answer was not for the scared girl she had been, but for the strong woman she was becoming. It was a choice made not from desperation, but from a clear-eyed recognition of the man he was, and the future she wanted to build beside him. A slow smile, genuine and radiant, spread across her face. "Yes," she whispered, the word full of a quiet, absolute certainty. "Yes, Thomas." It was an acceptance not just of a proposal, but of a life of shared burdens, shared joys, and a shared, resilient hope. The wedding was as quiet and sturdy as the life they were building. There was no white dress, no crowd of well-wishers, no celebratory feast. There was only the solemnity of a vow made in the heart of the home they had forged together. The traveling preacher, a gaunt man named Reverend Miller whom Thomas had sought out in a neighboring town, arrived on a dusty afternoon, his Bible tucked under his arm. He seemed to understand the gravity and privacy of the occasion, his demeanor respectful and blessedly free of prying questions. Claire wore her best dress, a simple gray cotton that she had painstakingly mended and pressed. She had woven a few late-blooming wildflowers into her hair, a small concession to tradition, their vibrant color a stark contrast to the austerity of the room. Thomas stood beside her, wearing a clean-work shirt, his hands washed and his hair combed. He looked solid, dependable, a rock against which any storm would break. Their only witnesses were the ones who mattered most. Luke and Anna lay on their blanket near the hearth, their soft gurgles and coos a gentle counterpoint to the preacher's solemn words. The ceremony was short, the words of the rite ancient and profound. When it came time for the vows, Thomas's voice was low and steady, a promise of shelter and fidelity that needed no embellishment. When Claire spoke her own vows, her voice was clear and strong, without a trace of the tremor that had once defined her. She was not a woman being saved, but a woman choosing her partner, her future. They had no rings to exchange. Instead, when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas simply took her hand, his large, callous palm enclosing hers completely. The gesture was more intimate, more binding than any piece of gold. He held her hand for a long moment, his thumb stroking the back of hers, and in the look that passed between them, a lifetime of understanding was communicated. After the preacher had accepted a cup of coffee and a piece of bread and gone on his way, a new kind of quiet settled in the cabin. It was the quiet of permanence, of belonging. Claire Hale. The name felt new and strange, yet completely right. She was no longer just Claire. She was part of something larger, a link in a chain that now included this man and this land. That evening, as the sun set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the floor, they sat together at the table. Thomas had taken Luke onto his lap, the baby's small hand clutching his father's finger. Claire held Anna, humming a soft lullaby. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, a symbol of the life and warmth they had cultivated against the odds. She looked at Thomas, at the way the firelight softened the weary lines around his eyes, and a feeling of immense, peaceful gratitude washed over her. Their story had not begun with a romance, but in the depths of winter, in shared grief and desperate need. It had grown slowly, nurtured by quiet acts of kindness and unspoken trust. It was a love story written not in poetry, but in the turning of the soil, the mending of a coat, the sharing of a silent vigil. This was their new beginning, earned and chosen. Outside, the first chill of autumn was in the air, but inside the small cabin, a new season had already begun, one of warmth, resilience, and the enduring promise of home.